Afternoon or good evening, wherever you may be. I'm Keith Luce with the National Committee on North Korea. We're really pleased to have you with us today, whether you are in the United States or somewhere overseas. We have a number of international viewers, and we welcome you as well. NCNK is an organization that works to promote principled engagement with North Korea. From time to time, we sponsor events. We're a venue for discussion and debate about U.S. policy, about diplomatic approaches to North Korea. And we are especially pleased today to have a couple of veterans with us. Dr. Hazel Smith is Professorial Research Associate at the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London, Professor Emerita in International Security at Cranfield University, UK, Advisory Fellow at the North Korea Economic Studies section of the Korea Development Institute in Seoul, and Fellow of the Royal Society of Arts since 1996, among many other things. And it's our pleasure to again have Dr. Smith with us. She has participated in a number of NCNK events in the past, and we always receive rave reviews. The same can be said about Troy Stangarone. He's much closer, located in Washington. Troy is Senior Director and Fellow at the Korea Economic Institute. He oversees KEI's trade and economic related initiatives, as well as the Institute's relations with Capitol Hill and the DC trade community. As part of his broader portfolio, he serves as the editor for KEI's flagship publication, Korea's Economy, and he oversees KEI's blog, The Peninsula. Like Dr. Smith, Troy also is an expert on sanctions. He has labored long and hard in this particular area, and we are really pleased to have Troy with us as well. And again, as with Dr. Smith, Troy has a much longer biography. So today we're taking a look at humanitarian exemptions to sanctions in North Korea. The sanctions issue is one which is somewhat controversial. It's an issue that sanctions are a policy option that the United Nations or the United States government tend to point to sanctions whenever North Korea engages in what is often referred to as bad or provocative behavior. So in the case of sanctions, the North Koreans, it seems, have almost turned sanctions into a sport of some type. They expect more sanctions. They diligently work to circumvent those sanctions, as does China, Russia along the way. And so it becomes a point, what in fact is the viability of sanctions in terms of impacting North Korea's behavior. But let me stop. I will ramble no longer. I will turn it over now to Dr. Smith, the real specialist here, along with Troy. And after Dr. Smith gives her presentation, Troy will then take it from there. Dr. Smith.
Thank you, Keith. And I'd really like to start by thanking Keith, Emerita, Seth, everybody at NCNK who's been behind the scenes putting this together. I'd like to thank anybody who's tuning in today as well for your time. I'm going to try to keep it to about half an hour and hopefully leave time for interaction, because that's part of the purpose of what I want to talk about today. I don't know how, I think probably most people today will be people who work on the DPRK and maybe not necessarily in the wider humanitarian field. So I want to start by saying, on the issue of humanitarian exemptions, there's actually quite a lot of literature, quite a lot of debate in the wider field of humanitarianism about the issue of humanitarian exceptions in terms of sanctions. Not much scholarly work, and there's a reason for this, which I'll talk about in a minute. But that debate, to my knowledge, has not really gone on in the DPRK world, the North Korea world. So my small aim today is to perhaps generate a discussion the conversation about humanitarian exceptions and not just the way it works in relationship to North Korea, but to expand the conversation from the sometimes narrow field, the narrow silo in which it's put, which is often just about how money and goods can be transferred into North Korea by humanitarian organizations. And also to put on the table a few suggestions about how the humanitarian exceptions regime could work in a different, perhaps better manner. And I would say from right from the get-go that I'm using the term regime here, not as a government that we don't like, but again, for those of you that have studied international relations in your careers, and I taught international relations theory for a very long time, for 30 years, and some people loved it and some people didn't. Some of you will recall Steve Krasner, Stanford University, Hoover Institution's understanding of regime, very influential understanding of the term regime as a set of principles, norms, rules, and decision-making procedures around which actor expectations converge in a given issue area. Our issue area, of course, is sanctions, UN sanctions in particular. And because I want to focus quite a lot on principles, norms, and rules, I think that this provides a good bucket, a conceptual bucket through which to think about humanitarian exceptions and the debate. I want to touch a little bit about on the broader debate, for those of you that are not familiar with it. There hasn't been much of a debate until recently because there was no policy need for it from about the early 2000s to about mid-2016. And the reason for that was that during that period, UN sanctions and often bilateral sanctions from governments were what was then called targeted or smart sanctions. And this meant that these regimes only targeted persons, institutions, or commodities that were directly linked to the issue that was targeted for policy change. In this case, it's North Korean denuclearization. And that was the case with DPRK sanctions as well from 2006 when they were first instituted till 2016. So when you have a targeted regime, you don't really have to think about exemptions because vulnerable people like children, for instance, or the sick, the old, are automatically protected. Of course, there are grey areas because the targeted sanctions, systems of targeted sanctions do not include the wider economy, the wider society. Now, it's not that the UN had not had any experience of humanitarian sanctions, most notoriously in Iraq in the 1990s, when the humanitarian exemptions regime, and some of you may have come across this either in person or worked with it or read about it, the humanitarian exceptions regime was this oil for food program, which was quite disastrous. It didn't work for anybody. But recently, sanctions were more or less targeted until 4 or 5 years ago, 7 years ago now. And so this debate on humanitarian exemptions didn't need to occur during that period. That's one reason it's recent. Now, for the broader international humanitarian community, the issue is how to protect the most vulnerable from broad sanctions regimes, from economy-wide, society-wide sanctions regimes, especially as the populations living in sanctioned regimes, sanctions where governments are being sanctioned, are almost by definition suffering from poor or bad domestic governance to start with. Now, this is an even more pressing issue for humanitarian organizations when sanctions are placed on poor countries with poor populations, on authoritarian countries, where by definition the population doesn't have any say or finds it difficult to have a say in changing government policy. So this whole relevance for humanitarian organizations over the past few years has meant that there has been quite a debate. It's been terminological, it's been legal, and there's been debates about practical issues regarding humanitarian exceptions. Now, the legal debates I'm not really going to touch on too much here, but I think one interesting one, which we could look at in terms of the DPRK, but maybe at another time, is that the legal debate broadly has been about the contradictions between international humanitarian law, which only requires humanitarian organizations to obtain the consent of the parties to conflict, to give humanitarian aid or to advocate for humanitarian aid or to assess humanitarian assistance, and that of sanctions legislation, the comprehensive sanctions legislation that requires, as it does in the DPRK, humanitarian organizations to also seek permissions from another party, in this case, the UN Sanctions Panel and the member states. And the practical debates, but I'm not going to come back to that unless anybody raise it in the question and answer. The practical debates have been also very varied. The one that I mentioned, the one that we talk about when thinking about the DPRK, how humanitarian organizations can pay for goods when there are asset control measures on those states. Lots of debates about the inordinate cost, the time necessary to apply for exemptions, not just the processing of them, but the time to apply for them, the bureaucracy. And as a corollary of that, lots of discussion about the way that the system, as it's evolving, actually is preventing NGOs and international non-governmental organizations, international governmental organizations like UN agencies, from responding quickly to humanitarian emergencies. So the point I want to make here is that, and I always try to do this when I'm talking about the DPRK, is to get away from the idea that the DPRK is an outlier. Only the DPRK, you have these considerations. It's not. These discussions are going on in relationship to countries all over the world, whether it's Syria, whether it's Lebanon, whether it's Ukraine, whether it's Myanmar, whether it's Bosnia-Herzegovina, whether it's Nicaragua, all over the world, these discussions are going on. But that discussion, as I said, hasn't really permeated the DPRK world, the world, I think, which most of us today are situated in. Usually, if we're talking about humanitarian exceptions, we're talking about, in terms of the DPRK, the obstacles humanitarian organizations face in paying for goods, the so-called, sometimes called the banking channel debate. And I want to suggest here that the narrowness of the discussion on North Korea and humanitarian exceptions perhaps reflects the very narrow way in which the DPRK humanitarian exemptions regime is constituted in the first place. And I also want to suggest that there's a conversation to be had about a more profound debate about humanitarian exceptions regimes in relationship to North Korea, with the focus on the well-being of North Koreans. To what extent is the system, the regime, performing a humanitarian function? And that's really where I'm going to be heading at in the next several minutes. So what's the current state of play with the UN humanitarian exemptions regime? Well, since 2017, the expansion of sanctions from targeted to broader sanctions, economy-wide sanctions, international organizations have had to seek humanitarian exemptions via the UN to work in North Korea. By September 2023, a couple of months ago, there had been a total of 98 humanitarian exemption requests. Some of these would be extension requests. And in 2023, this year, 27 approvals were actually in effect. These were sponsored by a mix of UN organizations like UNICEF, 3 NGOs, and the governments of Italy, Finland, and South Korea. Now, it's not clear from that data, and would have had to go a lot further to find out how many of those projects are actually being implemented, but 27 approvals are in effect. And the reason I think that we should be thinking about the relationship of what's actually approved to what actually goes on is that if you look at the figures in terms of the humanitarian aid that actually gets to North Korea, at least since 2013, it was negligible prior to the expansion of sanctions in 2016-17, and it's almost non-existent now, both relatively speaking to what North Korea was getting in humanitarian aid, say in the late 1990s, early 2000s, and to what the other countries which have high levels of humanitarian need are also receiving. So, for instance, since 2013, the volume of humanitarian assistance to North Korea has been about 40 million a year, which is really nothing in humanitarian aid terms. It amounts to about $1.50 per North Korean per year on average between 2013 and 2020. And after 2020, humanitarian assistance dipped to almost nothing, about 14 million in 2021, 2 million in 2022, and according to the UN records, just over $1 million promised for 2023. And remember, we've got a population of 26 million with 8 million children. And of course, there are reasons for that. We can go into that, but the point is that this debate that we're having about exemptions so far relates to a very, very tiny amount of humanitarian assistance that's gone into North Korea. So what's the primary function, which is, I think, important, of the North Korean DPRK, the UN? I'm talking here about the multilateral UN humanitarian exemptions regime. Now, the purpose is to provide a mechanism through which international humanitarian organizations can apply from exemptions, from sanctions regulations for specific defined humanitarian projects. Now, the projects must be humanitarian in nature, but the procedures and decision-making, the procedures and rules in terms of examining the projects for approval or not relate almost entirely to policing the sanctions, i.e. the export, policing the restrictions placed on export and import, export to North Korean export to North Korea and imports into North Korea. So the primary function provided by the humanitarian exemptions mechanism is to provide a policing mechanism for the UN sanctions system. It's not to respond to humanitarian need of the North Korean population. And this is very important. And we can see that if you look at all the information, and you talk to the organizations, because humanitarian need is assessed, but it's not assessed through the humanitarian exemptions process. It's assessed by the organizations that are putting forward the projects. The humanitarian exemptions regime has never, to my knowledge, disputed the fact that there is need, or that the need that's identified in any of these applications, it does not exist. So that's its primary purpose, the DPRK humanitarian exemptions regime. So because humanitarian work in North Korea always involves importing goods into the country, and also because effectively almost all imports into North Korea, apart from food and medicine, are either banned or have severe restrictions on them. This means that every item that the humanitarian organizations, in terms of the way the system works at the moment, want to take into the country has to be checked, approved through the humanitarian exemptions machinery. Now, I'm sure probably most people here are aware of the extent, not just of the export sanctions on North Korea, but also the import sanctions. You'll be aware that the imports into North Korea of all industrial machinery, all vehicles, anything which has got metals in it, so that includes tractors, trucks, irrigation equipment, all spare parts for agriculture, practically all components into for hospitals, blood pressure machines, etc. Screws, nails and screws, they're banned. Other items are banned implicitly because anything that could be seen as contributing to North Korea's nuclear program is also banned. And again, because I'm not sure that there is, even in the DPRK community, there is why would it be? It's a nerdy thing to be involved in, isn't it? A full understanding of what the sanctions cover. I just want to show you on screen some of the projects. This is from the UN site, which have received approval. Now, the first one I'm going to show you is approval for an American NGO, the Ignis Community, 2021. This organization works only in North Korea on children's health. And this is a project to ship medical and rehabilitation equipment for the Pyongyang Spine and Rehabilitation Center. And I want to show it to you because it gives you an idea of the type of goods which go through the process. And I'm hoping that my share screen will share screen effectively. Please tell me if it doesn't. Troy, can you put your thumb up if you can see it?
So
Can people?
I saw you click on the link, but I still see just the presentation slide. I don't see the document page you opened.
Okay, because this tells me I'm screen sharing. Can anybody see it?
Can you
No.
minimize the, I guess, slide there? Because maybe the actual page you opened is behind it.
No, it's not showing then.
No,
Sugar. Okay. Can you see it now?
it's still the same screen. Oh, there. Okay, there we go.
Okay. So this is, I'm going to go through this quickly because it's, loads of stuff, but you'll see the sorts of stuff that that's gone through the panel. You've got, this is for rehabilitation, spinal rehabilitation for children. You've got baby nuts and bolts climber. You've got the training equipment that you might see in a gym elsewhere. You've got, let me just scroll down, a baby chair. You've got baby's toys, chairs, shelves, wooden shelves, because they've got screws in them. You've got these community playthings, set of smart 5 trucks for children, village vehicles for children, little airplane, again, children's toys, blackboard, they've all got nails and screws in them. Children's equipment. So all this has to go through the through the humanitarian exemptions regime. The paperwork also, in terms of how the system works, and that's what I'm trying to get through at the moment, is very, very demanding. And I want to show you now some of the information that is required by humanitarian organizations when they wish to take this process through the system. This is, I'm sorry, I'm not more, can't do this easier, in an easier manner, but I think it just makes, not doing it, is it? I'm so sorry about this. Okay, well, this is the guidelines, and I'm not going to ask you to read through them all, but I'm going to scroll through, because even just looking at it, you can see the sorts of things that each humanitarian organization has to do before they can fill in the forms. So, and what's going to be in the forms. This list here, bullet points, starts to talk about it: nature of humanitarian assistance, explanation of recipients and criteria, reasons for requiring community lists, planned route and methods of transfer, planned dates of proposed transfer to the DPAK, financial transactions, etc., 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 etc. And there's reams of it. And what that means is that it's only if you've got the determination and the resources to navigate the system that you can actually cope with this system. Small NGO, unless you're backed by a government, which is what most of the South Korean NGOs are, would not be able to do this. And I want to give you, again, I'll try not to take up your time, but an example, and this one is an application from the Yeouido Full Gospel Mission Foundation in South Korea via the Republic of Korea government, and its aim is to support a cardiac hospital in the DPRK. So let me just try and see if I can do this again, because this gives an illustration more than I can, which says more than I can about the extent of the paperwork which is required. So this is just, I'm going to just go through the top, the top line here. It's the number of the item, the product name, then the code according to the trade regime, the make, the model, the manufacturer, the specification, the country of origin, the unit, the quantity, the value, the purpose, planned date of transfer, port of deportation, port of entry, parties involved in transaction, measures to ensure assistance to beneficiaries, other information. Let me just go, I'm just going to scroll through. This is a small project. This is not a major project. This is a small project. Now, this is for 1 year's expenditure. I calculated that I think I underestimated. It requires 22,572 bits of specific information, and that doesn't include the annexes. I'm not going to bring you, I've got more of these, but they all look like this. So suture needles for an item here, drained silicone, a bandage, sterile gloves, etc., etc. I think, you know, without labouring the point, you can see that this is a very complicated, complex, and time-consuming procedure. So in terms of the humanitarian exemptions regime, as it currently stands, as it currently works vis-a-vis North Korea, in many ways, the system really is best understood by what it is not. It's not a mechanism to protect the vulnerable from the impact of United Nations sanctions, whether these are intended or not. You know, forget about the debate about intention. Its remit does not include a duty to respond to humanitarian emergencies, and that includes the renewed food shortages we know have been severe since 2019. And I should have said also, it doesn't include, those vulnerable populations include the 8 million children, 8 million children under 18. Its remit is not to protect children. And it doesn't exempt humanitarian organizations from going through these procedures, even those with a long track record in the DPRK, like the Food and Agriculture Organization, UNICEF, or the World Food Programme. And most of all, it doesn't exempt civilian sectors like the food sector and the health sector from sanctions. So that's what it doesn't do. I mentioned about sanctions and humanitarian need. This is a debate that's sometimes brought up, but for our purpose, it's not all that relevant because the humanitarian exemptions regime doesn't take into account whether that need, humanitarian need, or whether humanitarian projects are generated because of UN sanctions or because of North Korean government failings or because of any other reason. Although the UN panel of experts repeatedly in its recent reports has informed those reading these reports, and I think they're very excellent reports, that there can be little doubt, and I quote, that United Nations sanctions have unintentionally affected the humanitarian situation. Now, personally, I don't think you need very sophisticated analysts. You don't need people like me who've worked for 30 years on this business to see that if 97% of any country's exports, which the Department of State tells us is the case in terms of North Korea, are banned, and if most imports, which are crucial for agriculture and industry, are also banned, then that's going to have a negative impact on the population, including children, especially in certain sectors like in food and in health. And in food security is something that I have worked on a lot, and the FAO has talked about as have particularly been negatively affected by, particularly domestic food production, by sanctions. Now, the UN Security Council, of course, and we should mention, reiterates that sanctions are not intended to have adverse humanitarian effects on the civilian population. But if you go back to 2006 or even 2016-17, it's very difficult to assess that because the UN, although it's mandated to do so, the UN Security Council never conducted an impact assessment prior to the expansion of sanctions in 2016 and 17 to the civilian economy, even though all the major UN humanitarian organizations were operating in North Korea at the time and had 25 years of extensive socioeconomic data, which they'd been collecting. But again, we should also note, and this is really important, and it's often said, and it's true, it's the North Korean government that has the primary responsibility for the welfare of its population. It's a primary responsibility for poverty and hunger, and it's not a good government. But we need to bear in mind that outside actors, like the United Nations, also have a legal and moral responsibility not to make things worse for a population which is vulnerable, poor, and already suffering from a bad government. So I've been through how the humanitarian exemptions system works in North Korea. It's a policing mechanism. It's economy-wide. It doesn't assess need because that's done by the humanitarian organization themselves. And I want to compare this, what I think is the assumptions of the general public regarding when the word humanitarian is used in terms of the humanitarian exemptions regime. Now, my view is, and I'd want to do a bit more work on this, but my view is if you were to put to the general, the informed public, or even to the media, I talk to the media talk to me quite a lot, the assumption that I hear is that they assume that the humanitarian imperative, i.e. the imperative to save lives and relieve suffering, does provide the conceptual underpinning and the practical purpose of the United Nations North Korea humanitarian exceptions system. And this is because, quite straightforwardly, whenever the term humanitarian is invoked, the general public might assume that the UN humanitarian exceptions regime is something to do with the core function of international humanitarianism. And this is to intervene, to save lives, and to ameliorate suffering when governments cannot or do not respond effectively to threats to life, either because they're a bad government or there's a war going on or there's a natural disaster, but mostly because you've got a bad government. Now, I think that there's a discrepancy here between what are common sense assumptions as to the purpose and functioning of the United Nations DPRK humanitarian exceptions regime and how it works in practice. And again, I'd want to do a bit more work on that, some empirical work, but I think that that's not an unreasonable conclusion to draw. Now, we know that the system's recently been changed to help international humanitarian organizations find ways to pay throughout the whole UN, not just in terms of North Korea, find ways to pay for services and goods in countries where asset control orders are implemented. Sanctions Committee has also, I think, done very well in speeding up consideration of applications. But these changes don't respond to what I consider as a key problem generated by the system itself. And this is the extensive and time-consuming nature of the forms and information and research that must be done by any organization prior to the application being considered by the committee. But these practical issues are not just a practical issue by themselves, they arise out of the fundamental conceptualization of the system as primarily a policing mechanism for the UN sanctions legislation. Now, there are alternatives that are practiced in different parts of the world. And again, as I develop this into a more fully fledged paper, I want to be looking at other UN humanitarian exceptions regime, but I have looked quite closely at the EU understandings of humanitarian alternatives, and their terminological understandings are actually very useful. They argue for a broad category called humanitarian exceptions, and they say that this can be done in more or less two ways, other ways, but let's say more or less two ways: derogation and what they call exemptions. So there are exceptions at the top category, then derogation and exemptions. The DPR for the EU derogation systems, broadly speaking, can be compared to the way the UN system works right now. Detailed permission is needed prior to the delivery of humanitarian assistance. But exemptions regimes don't require the humanitarian organization to seek prior authorization in the face of demonstrable human need. The overriding principle, and I quote from the EU legislation, is that in accordance with international humanitarian law, where no other options are available, the provision of humanitarian aid should not be prevented by EU sanctions. So I'm going to conclude now by saying, and again, I'm hoping to have a conversation here, that we know that there is demonstrable human need in the food and health sector in particular. It's not impossible for food and health to be exempted from sanctions. It's not impossible to have a regulatory authority, which happens in some areas of the world, which could be constituted, for instance, by South Korea and by China. The South Korea probably end up providing most of the money for humanitarian assistance, and China, any assistance mainly comes through China, could have delegated responsibility for overseeing a regime of what the EU calls exemptions, whereby food and the health sector go, and humanitarian organisations work through that. This is somewhat like the way that CADO, the Korean Energy Development Organization, worked in the 1990s when Japan, South Korea, and the United States monitored imports that were going into North Korea vis-a-vis the CADO mechanisms. It was quite a light touch, but it was quite rigorous at the same time, and it meant that things moved very quickly. And I would just caveat the whole lot by saying that, of course, improved procedures and decision-making structures so that bilateral and multilateral assistance can more easily respond to the needs of North Korea's vulnerable population, particularly 8 million children, will not on its own solve all the problems facing North Korea's children. We've got a North Korean government that since 2020 has closed its borders, whose leaders personally do not suffer from sanctions. In many ways, they've benefited from sanctions, and who allow the population to carry the costs of what it considers its national security priorities. Then we might want to think about that. Why have sanctions haven't really achieved denuclearization, but they have done a lot of damage to the population. And the other caveat is that even with improved procedures, there's not much evidence so far over the last few years that humanitarian assistance would be anywhere near what's required to fill the food and health gaps, given what we know about the extent of humanitarian need in North Korea. Thank you.
Thank you, Hazel. Before we turn to Troy, just a note to our audience that if you have questions or comments, you may submit those through the Q&A function. Troy?
Well, Keith, thank you for having me. Hazel, thanks for the presentation, putting this important issue on the table. We talked a little bit before we came on about maybe doing this more as a conversation. So I think, there's a couple of things I want to maybe try and either draw you in a different direction or have a conversation with you about. And one is talking about just more broadly humanitarian aid to North Korea. You mentioned early on in your remarks that since 2013, humanitarian aid has averaged about $40 million into North Korea. That drops off in 2020 to almost negligible amounts. And I look at this and I can see essentially three distinct periods here. 2013 to, maybe depending on where you put the demarcation off for the new sanctions coming into place that target commodities and things in 2016 to 2018, and then 2018 to the beginning of the pandemic. And then I think the pandemic clearly explains sort of why it drops off there. But so I'd be kind of curious, from your perspective, it seems as though that if you look at the period under Kim Jong-un pre-sanction and then the period sort of post-sanctions, that humanitarian aid was roughly the same in terms of going to North Korea. So in that sense, it seems as though the broader question is why the international community wasn't necessarily providing humanitarian aid to North Korea rather than the sanctions themselves.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. And, I can't, 30 minutes, I can't cover everything.
Yeah.
One of the reasons that there wasn't so much humanitarian assistance up until after 2013 was that after 2000, the last major significant bit of humanitarian assistance was under the early part of was under the Obama administration, 2012-13, and then there was the pretty disastrous falling out between North Korean government, the Obama administration. The leap year deal collapsed, and part of the leap year deal had involved food aid. So that was one reason that we saw diminution. But the main thing was that after the famine years of the 1990s, North Korean food production, on which most of the population rely, recovered. Now, it's not a great agricultural food strategy, but North Korea's food strategy is that most people, 26 million population, large population, as big as the population of Australia, obtain their food from local food production, whether that's through the government, whether it's distributed through the government or through markets. Most of it is grown rather than imported, some imports. Now, because we have the Food and Agriculture Organization and WFP and quite a degree of monitoring, including from the South Korean rural agricultural Institute, that we had a lot of monitoring, and US Department of Agriculture has actually done some fantastic work, analytical work on North Korean food production, and still continues to do so, actually. We know that North Korean food production improved after the famine years, so that between 2008 to 2017, local domestic food production was enough to feed the population with only a small import requirement, about 500,000 tons. And of that for those that don't do agriculture, North Korea needs about 5.5 million tons a year, broadly speaking, to feed its population at basic levels. So if it gets about 5 million tons, 500,000 tons is a manageable import requirement. And after 2008, that manageable import requirement was fulfilled from about half from concessional food aid, food assistance, some of it paid for but cheaper, and half from food imports that were bought by the North Korean government or by companies. Now, what happened with the implementation of the 2016, but particularly the 2017 sanctions? Agriculture, which is mainly food production in North Korea, in some countries it isn't. In the United States, for instance, agriculture includes silk production and production for clothing. So in North Korea, it's mainly food production. The agriculture is about 1/3 of the economy in North Korea. However we haven't got exact statistics, but good enough for our purposes. So if you have civilian-wide sanctions, and in those sanctions you have a reduction in oil, and you don't allow any machinery, tractors, spare parts, anything for irrigation machinery or drying machinery, which you need for crops. And if you have a blanket import ban, that, it doesn't have to be exactly corresponding to 1/3 of the economy that agriculture is, but it's going to pretty much affect agriculture, and which is already under-resourced, undercapitalized because of poor government policies. And we saw that that's exactly what it did. In 2018, the first year of the implementation of the expanded sanctions, we saw a huge reduction in the food grown in North Korea available for domestic food consumption, from it being slowly growing anyway, but it was a huge reduction to 1.5 million tons short in 2018. Now, the food produced in 2018 is what is needed for 2019, more or less. So it simply wasn't available in 2019. 2019, we think, we're not sure, because we don't have it all recorded, that the Chinese government, there was a visit by President Xi to North Korea in 2019, gave very substantial food aid, maybe as much as 1 million tons, maybe again in 2020, but not in 2021, and not in 2022, and so far we can't see it in 2023. What's also happened since 2018, harvests have not, even though we haven't been in the country, we've got pretty good data because of the various modelling, very sophisticated modelling that was done by the South Korean Rural Economic Administration, the US Department of Agriculture also supporting these results. We know that food production, local food production, hasn't gone up. I mean, it's still stayed with around 1 million tons short, which is catastrophic for distribution for food availability for North Koreans. At the same time, we've got markets that the North Korean government has tried to crack down on. So especially in the border areas, there was food being imported through grey area transactions through traders, and sometimes going throughout the whole country. North Korean, we don't know, because we haven't been in for the past 2.5 years. We don't know how much of that market activity is left, but we do know all the signs show that the government has made a big effort to try to cut it down. So that means we know that there is still, since 2018, after we'd had basically the recovery of North Korean food production to be able to feed its population, we know that from 2018, that has gone, basically it's been slashed. And also because the North Korean government actions to try to control the markets and its closure of borders, that the markets which brought in some imported food has gone. So we can see a clear differentiation in the from 2018 after the impact of sanctions, of the expanded sanctions. But what we don't know enough about is what was we've got sporadic information, some of it I think which is very credible, about starvation in pockets of the country. Household stocks will have diminished by now, after 5 years of failed harvests, 23, it's now 23, 5 years of failed harvests. So local, whether it's local stocks, government stocks, institution stocks, because they'll have gone. So that's when we do see a clear differentiation. And it's ameliorated initially by the Chinese government. We don't know how much. The Russians, for all the publicity about they're going to do this and they're going to do that, they don't actually end up usually giving North Korea very much grain aid, but it remains to be seen how much they're going to give in return for these conventional arms if these have indeed been shipped to Russia.
Well, I mean, on I think the Russia side, one of the things that's interesting is both North Korea has said that they had a good harvest this year, and the Russians have said that the North Koreans have told them they don't want grain aid. So it seems whether they need it or not, at least publicly, they're saying they don't. I think one of the things that's interesting, I was looking back at the trade data, and I looked in terms of quantity because oftentimes people look at value, and value can be deceptive because prices fluctuate and things. And if you look at basically the imports of fertilizer, one, North Korea's imports tend to fluctuate, which probably reflects differences in needs from what they can produce domestically. But two, clearly there's some disruptions in the pandemic, but in 2021, they imported roughly about 10 million less kilograms than they had in sort of the average. There's one year that was very much higher, but in the few years beforehand. So it seems as though, there's sporadic amounts, but they're getting some of the fertilizer, maybe not as much as they need. So I think, though this kind of gets to your, point, it's sort of one of the things that I kind of want to ask is like, so if we look at this, because, you're right, the UN report says that, whether it's intentional or not, there has been an impact of sanctions. It also says we can't disaggregate how much is actually regime policy and how much is the sanctions. But taking that, whether it's 5% or 30% is, sanctions based, going in now, given the restrictions, and I was looking at some of the comments from the NGOs. And one of the things that sort of struck me is some of them pointed out that even before the pandemic restrictions, they had faced trouble getting goods in. But so there's two sides to this coin, which is that one, we need some type of assessment on, what the actual needs are, because we can estimate some things on food, but clearly there's going to be medical needs for tuberculosis and other things. But then two, once we get that assessment, how do we then work with the North Korean government to ensure that even if we resolve the blockages on our side, that they resolve them on their side so that this aid can actually get to the people who need it?
My view is that the main problem in humanitarian terms facing the North Korean population, particularly the poor, the vulnerable, the ones that are not privileged, is food. And aid is not an answer for food. It's recovering, in the short term, recovering food production. Now, of course, in classical economic terms, this doesn't make sense. They should be importing. But while you have sanctions which ban all their exports, they can't be importing much food. And I'm not suggesting here that sanctions be lifted altogether. I think they need to be reviewed. So if we still have sanctions on exports, of course there'll be some smuggling, but basically they're not going to have that great export earnings. Then how do we, if we really want to respond to the food problem, which is, we can't respond to every problem in North Korea. And I'm just talking about the basics, the right to life, to eat. Then it's about getting food production going again. And I think that that's possible to do if the food sector and possibly the health sector is exempted from sanctions. And I think that that could be fairly easily done. Aid, I did a calculation the other day using US aid figures as to how much it would cost if we use how much the US aid pays to send food aid abroad from its, and I calculated that to supply 1 million tons of food a year, I haven't got the right, forgive me if I'm not getting this right, but it's over $1 billion. It's enormous by the time you take transport and everything into account. So that, when you consider that aid at the moment is 1 million a year, and even in the relatively good times before the expansion of sanctions, it was 40 million a year, that's not realistic. So I think what we're doing is we have to do it the other way around. We have to say, what's the main problem that we can deal with and that we should be dealing with ethically in terms of the population, not the government. And that to me is food, and that to me is doing something about ameliorating the import blocks that they have. Now, I'm not convinced either that even that is going to attract the North Korean government very much, because the way that President Xi is going domestically, he's much more in tune with Kim Jong-un's view of how the population should be dealt with than previous Chinese leaders who thought that the Kim family were an anachronism, and but now they're much more in tune. And if the Kim family can obtain food from China, if China continues to have grain surpluses, and if it's managed to get over its the COVID problem, there's no reason why it wouldn't continue to have grain surpluses. Then there are some advantages both to North Korea, not to have to deal with the international organizations coming in and getting data, which they've done for 25 years. And there are some advantage to China, making North Korea more of a vassal state than it is, in continuing an arrangement where food aid or food assistance and fertilizer assistance, you mentioned fertilizer, comes from China, and where they can make North Koreans pay for it, they will, because that's what they do. North Korea has not historically received energy assistance from China. They've paid premium prices for energy assistance from China. So that's my view on the way geopolitically things will be going. But if international organizations do go in, then I think then the food issue is something that is primary, food and health. I'm sorry if that didn't.
No. I know we only had a couple of minutes, so maybe I'll fold one question in and then let Keith maybe add one to that just before we turn it over to the general Q&A. I agree with you. Ultimately, this is something to where North Korea is going to need to produce most of the food domestically. Kim Jong-un, when he came to power, had started sort of experimenting with agricultural reform, but they've essentially rolled all of that back now. And at the end of the day, the biggest thing they could do to take and improve the food situation is to actually embrace agricultural reform. So do you think there's anything we could do? And I mean, clearly there's going to need to be a bridging part of this of providing some aid, but you don't want to provide so much aid that you put local farmers out of business. So there's a balance, but that we can do to encourage them to actually embrace agricultural reform rather than to sort of turn away from it. And Keith, I'll turn things back over to you, I guess, with that.
I think the short answer is really no, because their priority at the moment, first of all, there's two things. One is food. One is in terms of I agree, actually, agricultural reform would help productivity. But the other thing in North Korea, which is very apparent, is that they don't have inputs. They don't have enough fertilizer. Human waste is used regularly instead of human fertilizer. They don't have enough basic things like plastics, and so there is some. They are going to have to buy things from somewhere to be able to. In terms of agricultural reform, you're right. The opposite is happening. It looks like what they've done is formalized in law recently in the last couple of years, a system which they always said they would never do. Well, not until the full flowering of the socialist revolution, which was that they would keep cooperative farms having some autonomy as compared to, say, state farms, which are waged workers. But it looks like over the last year, what they've done is formalized, which they always did it, but they said they weren't doing it, formalized the idea when practically all the produce is taken from farmers. So one of the reasons that the system isn't working, that was nominally the reform, is that by the time they've taken everything away after the harvest, there's simply nothing left other than basic survival rations to give to households on the farm. So it makes no difference whether you've got 15 points or 1 point in terms of your household or your sub-work team, because there's only enough left to give as survival rations to the population. Now, that was always seen in the 1990s as a regime of exception. That was the system in the 1990s because of the fact that there was famine and food shortages. Since then, they've more or less maintained the system. They keep taking away, but they never formalized it. It looks like, and again, I want to find out a bit more, that's been formalized in the last year. So in terms of your question, no, I think it's going backwards. And I think the other thing that might be happening in terms of that summit with Putin is that the big Russian agro-industrial exporters, which do contract farming abroad, they may be negotiating with them to come in to provide inputs, not through FAO anymore, but through some of these Russian big firms, and to keep the system going, because it doesn't make any difference to Russia if the system's kept going like that. But they could maybe be doing these joint ventures in that way, which will freeze the system, not expand the system.
Yeah, that would be interesting. I hadn't seen that, but I'd also point out that joint ventures would be just another Russian sanctions violation. But Keith, thank you.
So thank you both. Dr. Smith will have a couple of questions for you here in a moment. First, just some comments on my part. I'm truly amazed listening to today's presentations by Hazel Smith and Troy Stangarone. They take me back to 21 years ago, my first trip to North Korea. I was working at the Senate Agriculture Committee. Senator Lugar was the chairman. The Senate was going to be voting on as to whether or not the U.S. government should continue to provide USG assistance to the World Food Program for distribution in North Korea. And when I made that first trip, so many of the issues are what we're talking about today. Is there diversion? Why does the North Korean leadership put on so many restrictions to prevent distribution of assistance to its population, on and on and on? So I'm truly amazed at that recall. I would like to point out that on the exemptions process, if in fact North Korea decides to allow the international humanitarian community, US or otherwise, the United Nations, to again provide assistance, as the US NGOs, for example, go about the exemptions process, one of the questions will be how the US government, how the United Nations will view signing off on exemptions for development projects versus life-saving projects. For example, digging wells, that's clean water, right? To NGOs, that's life-saving. To sometimes in the past, to authorities who make decisions on these things, they would view well drilling as development projects. There are many other examples, but that will be a very interesting area of debate if in fact the North reopens to allow outside assistance. I'd also like to point out that I mean, Hazel, you did a great job providing such a comprehensive overview. I'd like to just provide a little bit of additional context to point out that the State Department has continually worked with the U.S. humanitarian NGO community and has offered some modifications to travel restrictions to the North. And these modifications are helpful to the NGOs as they attempt to plan trips, their budgets, et cetera. I'd also like to point out that according to information that we're receiving from NGOs, that the Treasury Department, that OFAC, is in fact very timely in its review and consideration of license applications. So the Biden administration, at least the signaling we're getting today, is that there is not opposition to the renewal of privately funded U.S. humanitarian assistance to North Korea. Now, if the border reopens, if in fact such is allowed in, that will open up a range of new areas for discussion and consideration. We are 1 minute till 4. We're going to go over just a few minutes here with the indulgence of Hazel and Troy. We have one question from Gordon Kang. And Hazel, as you answer these questions, please do so in as abbreviated form as possible so we can cover more. Gordon Kang says, thank you for your presentation, Hazel. It was very insightful as always. I would like to ask how interministerial cooperation within the DPRK has at times smoothened or perhaps introduced more obstacles to the flow of humanitarian aid or ag cooperation into the country.
My experience, which is a long time old now, but it's the experience of my colleagues, is that the different institutions in North Korea fight like cats in a sack in terms of wanting to appropriate resources. But it's difficult for outsiders to see. You can see the results of it when there are contradictory outputs if you're dealing with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or the Institute of Agriculture or something else. So it's a, I think, as Gordon knows, it's a very siloed bureaucratic process in North Korea. On the other hand, I think that the organizations that have been working there a long time, like the UN organizations, but some of the smaller NGOs now are very familiar with that process and know how to work around it.
All right, thank you. Austin Hedrick poses the following. Dr. Smith made the argument that outside governments have a moral responsibility to not make the situation of North Koreans worse, i.e. bad governance, food insecurity, etc. Where do these moral responsibilities come from? Also, is there a moral obligation to hold bad governments responsible for bad governance? And if so, how do those moral obligations to hold bad governments responsible relate to moral obligations to not make the situation of North Koreans worse?
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. I published a piece a couple of years ago which looked exactly at these issues, but I think the core of it is determining the difference between the government of a country and the population of a country. And in international humanitarian law, which is codified in a number of different areas, but particularly in the Red Cross, and it's very clear actually it's much clearer in wartime than it is in peacetime, because the Geneva Conventions in particular codify that it's an offence, it's a war crime to damage the food population of a country, of a the food production, consumption, availability of the food of a population living in a country which even has a, you know, which has a heinous government. So it's a war crime to do that, to damage food production. So I think that if the Geneva Conventions are used as an analogy to peacetime, which they often are in the sanctions literature, we can see that it's the civilians and what are called innocents, usually children, the sick, the international responsibility according to this system of international ethics, which derives basically from international law in general, international humanitarian law, which some of it is codified with the Red Cross, simply precludes civilians being targeted. And some people might not like it. I think that's a very good idea. It doesn't preclude taking arms against a government, another government, an enemy government, particularly in self-defense. And of course, in real life, it gets messy. We've only got to see the Israel-Palestine dispute at the moment and the conflict to see about the different interpretations of what constitutes ethical responsibilities to innocents and individuals. So this is never clear-cut. And especially when there is a conflict going on, it's a very, very difficult thing to do. But it doesn't mean to say that we don't have to think about it. In the UN, there are clear responsibilities to protect, which are ingrained throughout the whole of their structures and which are enshrined in the various international regulations which emanate from the United Nations. So there is a lot. There's in international ethical. I want to say law, but international ethical norms is a better word. There is a clear responsibility to protect civilians. And in international law, in wartime, there is an overt responsibility to protect civilians, especially those that are non-combatants and that are civilians that live in an enemy country. So it is a very good question. It's not an easy one to answer. I say I've done some work on this. I'll send it to you if you're interested in this. But it means that we do have responsibility to try to work our way through this.
All right, Hazel, we have a number of questions left, but I will narrow those questions to one question. Steve Norper comments, he says, Hazel, I've got your excellent book on the shelf here. It's required reading for my past Columbia University grad courses. Might you offer thoughts on the military employed on food harvest and any other aspects of military and sanctions? Steve Norper.
Well, it's a really good question. The military have a dual role in, well, the poor infantry, I won't swear that the word that's used in England, the infantry, the conscripts, these kids that go in for 7 years, 17, come out 24, 25, even later sometimes, they have a dual role. They do all this defense drills and all the rest of it. And they also participate in construction, in agriculture, in house building. Anybody who's been to North Korea will see them all over the place doing this. They're not very well off. If they live in camps, they don't have access to food because they often live away from home. They don't have access to food from their families, and starvation and certainly malnutrition of these young men, mainly men, but some women, has been a constant problem in North Korea. I mean, and I must say, I think that there are worse things to be doing than taking than participating in the civilian economy. They could be doing a lot worse things. So yes, that is part of the way that the system works in North Korea. Again, when we think about the military, we need to disaggregate it. The ones at the top are clearly very privileged, and they take part in the political. Well, they have influence on the political decision making, and the party has influence on the military decision making. But these conscripts, the people that make up it, live in dreadful conditions. I mean, it's one of the reasons that the North Korean government has developed the nuclear, what it calls the deterrent, the nuclear bomb, because it doesn't believe that those conscripts will be reliable, or will they ever have to be placed in action against an invader.
Thank you, Hazel. Troy, any final comments?
Yeah, just a few real quick comments on like some of the maybe technical aspects of sanctions and exemptions. So one, I was reading through submissions by NGOs to the UN, and a couple of things struck me. One, the UN has put in place reforms to try and expedite things, and that seems to have been helping, though there's some mixed views in terms of how much, but it seems like that's made some progress. Two, one of the suggestions was the creation of a whitelist, presumably to try and avoid some of the long listings of what Hazel had shown us. I think there's probably some merit to that idea, but I think the challenge becomes is even if you develop a whitelist, there's still going to probably need to be some inspection process before any goods are shipped to North Korea to make sure that other things aren't being put in with whitelist exempted items. Also, Hazel mentioned, and there's a lot of talk about the banking situation getting money into North Korea. I think this is going to be much harder to solve than people think. When we lifted sanctions on Iran during the Iran nuclear deal period with Obama, Treasury wrote a letter to banks because nobody would provide loans. And even with Treasury's assurance that, it's okay to do this now, basically, once you get to a certain point with certain countries, financial institutions are just like, it's not worth it. The business isn't big enough. It's, too dangerous of a risk. So I think we need to be more creative in probably trying to come up with a solution, because I don't think one of the suggestions in the legislation on Capitol Hill was that Treasury basically take and tell banks that this is okay to do. I think that's going to be unlikely to work in everything. I think we're going to have to try and find a bank that's dedicated to doing this and that's willing to take and be the channel for it. And then the last thing I would say just real quick is that one of the interesting things in the comments, which I, to be honest, hadn't thought about, is North Korea requires vehicle insurance. Not necessarily strange, we have to insure our cars, everything too. The only entity, though, in North Korea that provides vehicle insurance is a sanctions entity. So you're kind of in a damned if you do, damned if you don't position if you're an NGO. So I think that's something where we need to think about too, is sort of these little on the ground challenges to where certain entities that you may have to work with are sanctions, and how you take and deal with that.
Thank you, Troy. And the banking channel issue, which Hazel and you both have referred to, is an important one, not only for U.S. NGOs, but for the international community as a whole. It's interesting that a few months ago, there was a transfer of about $1 million, I believe, into North Korea, a project that involved input from a range of governments. It was a trial run to see what was possible. I believe that those are funds which the United Nations will need for its basic operations in the future, as or if it ramps back up. But at least that's a positive sign that there was, with that one-off project, a willingness to work together and to try to find a solution. The long term, yes, the banking channel is critical, and it's one which has so many ancillary issues tied to it. I want to thank both Hazel and Troy for being with us today. I want to thank those of you who have stayed with us in the audience. We really appreciate your persistence. And with that, on behalf of my colleagues, Marissa McPherson, Seth Joyner, I would say thank you and have a good day or evening wherever you may be. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.